can you start us off by talking about this, looking at this book you wrote at a time when it applies to so many more people than 20 somethings?
Totally. Well, first of all, thank you for being here, Meredith. I'm a huge fan of the Love Letters podcast, and so I'm so thrilled to be here with Meredith. And thank you all for joining. I see some people on this list that I know just through like LinkedIn, like, hi Kish, it's nice to see you, and other people. So thank you all for being here, and I hope to answer all of your burning questions. But the reason that I was so attracted to this topic of the 20s, and for the record, I'm 37, so I'm well past my 20s myself, was because I just feel like our 20s are this amazing period in our lives when we are experiencing so much chaos. And for anybody who's in their 20s or remembers their 20s clearly, I think we all have this experience of trying to figure out what we want from life and trying to make good decisions, but simultaneously being attracted to to being impulsive and to making those mistakes and to exploring the world, right? And it's in that process of, on the one hand, thinking very, consciously about our future, and on the other hand, experiencing the chaos of the world, that we figure out who we are and what we want from life. And I think that helps us in the decades that come after that. I think that now, what you're saying, Meredith, is so true. We have been thrust into a chaos that, that is uncommon, and a lot of us feel like we're out of control, like the world is out of control. Things that we had a good grip on, we no longer have a good grip on. And I think, as you're saying, it's for many of us, it is creating this the conditions for new clarity. I personally have, spent a lot of time thinking about, what makes me happy, what matters to me, who is important in my life. And these are questions that I think we are constantly thinking about in our 20s because of the experiences that we have in those years. But many of us are beginning to think about that again. And I actually think that it's very valuable, because I think that, we go through our 20s, we figure some stuff out, and then we enter, our 30s and 40s, and then life sort of takes over. And, we find the careers that we want to pursue, we meet the people that we end up with, and then we stop really thinking so much about these questions. And these questions are so important, because if we're not thinking about them, we can't go ahead and sort of create the lives that are aligned with our values and our passions and the things that really matter to us. So as much as I dislike the feeling of being out of control, and as much as the chaos feels stressful a lot of the time, I believe that all of us can find, can use this period, can harness this period to propel us forward in the decades that come after this.
That's a great answer. And that's by the way, my pitch to buy this book is a gift for not just 20 somethings, but for yourself if you were older than 20 somethings, because, again, at 43, I'm reading it and I'm like, yes, good question. So, and it is very funny, you mentioned the podcast, and randomly our next season is about lessons people learned at different ages. And I keep thinking, why are the teenagers and the 20-somethings I interview far more introspective than the older people I interview? Why do they seem smarter? And I think it's because they're trained to believe they're allowed to ask questions, that we do stop asking questions after a certain point. One of the things I wanted to ask you, which sounds like a very basic question, but I think there's great confusion in the world about this. I often hear, oh, those millennials. And often people are talking about like 21-year-olds, and I'm like, I don't even think they're a millennial. So can you talk about
Gen Z?
Who is represented in this book? Who are these generations? What kind of people did you talk to?
Totally. And also, hi, Laura. I'm seeing different people popping up, and so it's nice to see.
And please, by the way, that chat button is open this whole time. You don't have to wait till the end to ask a question. So please leave your questions as we're talking, as it hits you. It's the wonderful thing about doing this on Zoom is you don't have to wait to raise your hand until the end. So
Totally. I think generations just as a concept are so fascinating because they're totally artificial and they're totally constructed. And yet as journalists, as a journalist, I'm still fascinated whenever a poll comes out about what millennials or Gen Z, what they're thinking. And as artificial as that, I mean, we all know that that's artificial, right? Because people have made stereotypes about all of our generations. And we're all like, well, that's not really true. But I do think that there are interesting, trends that happen over time that do shape different generations, right? And so I'm 37, so according to most demographers, that would make me the oldest of the millennials. And then, and then you go back 15 years. So the 22-year-olds are still millennials, and then those younger than 22 are Gen Z. And I think it's so interesting how we've all been stereotyped, right? I think for millennials, there have been all of these ideas about how we're snowflakes. We have spent all our money on avocado toast. We don't have money to buy houses. There are all of these interesting stereotypes about us. But here are some things that I can tell you for sure, based on the research that I've done and based on my interactions with people. We're a generation that's been through quite a lot of trauma. We came of age during the Great Recession. We also, were around and shaped by 9/11. So those are some of the events that basically have shaped our lives, right? And so that's one aspect of our identity, our collective identity. But there are other interesting things about us. One is that our parents, so those of us who are millennials, our parents had fewer children and they invested a lot more in each one of us. So our parents spent a lot more time with us and invested a lot in us. They invested a lot of their hopes, their dreams, their desires for the future, and I think that that's maybe why this idea of the helicopter parent and the snowflake comes about. But there's another interesting side to this that we're all experiencing now. Those of us who are in the process of getting jobs and starting families, because our parents spent so much time with us and invested so much of themselves in us. We have these very lofty expectations about finding a career. There's been a concept of having your kids go out and find a dream job, right, for a long time. This concept of going out and finding your vocation and finding your dream job has been part of culture for hundreds of years. But it's actually not until really the millennials that the majority of people were able to find jobs that really aligned with their values and their passions. And so for those of us who are millennials, our parents, spent a lot of time telling us, go out there and find your dream job, and they considered us so lucky that we would, unlike their generation, most of us would actually find that job. But actually, that's a lot of pressure. And so for many of us in our 20s and 30s, this idea of trying to find a career that aligns with our values and our passions and our identity, that has been a major struggle in our life. Because it actually takes a long time to figure out what it is that we really want and then find a career that aligns with that. So I think that my book really tackles this challenge because it is kind of like the dominant anxiety and struggle for many 20-somethings. In fact, some data shows that that those of us who are millennials, our predominant anxiety and obsession is in finding a job that really is an expression of ourselves. We care about that more than we care about finding love. So that's a dominant thing that those of us in our 20s and 30s millennials are dealing with. But the other thing is love. Like love has been transformed for our generation because again, for most of history, there has been this idea of trying to find a soulmate. So somebody who really understands you, who you can talk to, you can have a companionate relationship with, so you can be best friends with this person who's also your life partner. That has been an ideal in society for a long time. But as recently as the 60s, a lot of women, a large percentage of women, like over 60% of women, were not marrying for love, you know, because most women did not have a source of income, and so they had to make compromises in terms of finding a partner. That is not true for our generation. For those of us who are in our 20s and 30s, not only do we have this ideal of finding a soulmate, many of us will actually find somebody who does, really understand us and resonate with us, and meets us on all of these different levels. But there are complications with that too. The dominant way that most of us are finding partners is through online dating, which is an entirely new medium, which is very complicated, right? Because there are all of these other, problems that come along with online dating, the least of which is that we don't really spend much time interacting with someone before we decide whether to keep them in our lives or not. So there are all kinds of new problems. So these are kind of the dominant threads of the millennial generation. And we're only now beginning to learn a little bit about Gen Z, the generation that's coming. But they seem like they're similar to millennials, but they're in some ways they're rejecting some of the things that were true of us, right? I think they might be a little bit more pragmatic than we are, because we're pretty idealistic about all of these different things, career and soulmates and all of this stuff. The little bit of data that is coming through about this generation suggests that they are sort of pushing back against our idealization of all of these different things. But yes, that's a very long answer to the generational question.
It's a great answer, and as much as we call these generational names arbitrary, they don't feel arbitrary in that way, because as a Gen Xer, it's like, we had the parents who were like, go watch 7 hours of television. We can't watch you right now. And in fact, there was this common joke made at the start of pandemic that the Gen Xers were fine because we were latchkey kids who were, that's what they called it, right? Who were just like left alone to figure it out. And then you see this change with millennials where there were more lessons, there was more investment, and the pressure that comes with that is so great. And then adding on top of that, the pressure to find this perfect mate. And why can't you? Because you have all of this variety at your disposal. I think one of the most frightening and interesting things to me as a relationship columnist so many years ago was learning that college students many years ago were using apps to meet people. And I just thought, wait a minute, you're on a college campus. You're like surrounded by, it's the only time in life where you're surrounded by peers who are most likely single, and yet you still have to wonder what else is out there, what else you can be seeing.
Totally. And the research shows that actually online dating has made people less likely to just talk to one another when they see each other. So online dating came a few years after I started dating. And so I didn't do online dating until like well into my late 20s. But it's changed behavior. It's changed, our willingness to just talk to somebody that we meet, at a coffee shop. And so it just limits options for people who are not necessarily comfortable with that space, right?
You do a wonderful thing in this book by not allowing the world to dictate priorities of 20-somethings. You come up with some categories to consider for 20-somethings right now. And that is, I think, what becomes most relevant to me as an older person reading it when I was thinking about it in the context, in my selfish, narcissistic context of my own life. I was like, okay, well, like, you make a chapter about hobbies. You let people know that, you could have written an entire book about the 20-something experience within a job market and defining yourself based on your career. And yet you go far beyond that and you say, let's holistically look at your life. What is the life you are building? So when you went about considering what makes a good life, how did you decide what these pieces were to make that puzzle?
It's so interesting, and I think it's so interesting that you're talking about it in this way. But it's absolutely true. I think that this is a benefit of living past my 20s and writing the book as a 30-something, because while all of us, even those of us who are past our 20s, for most of the last 100 years, the dominant priorities in our 20s, or the dominant things that went into creating a good life, was career and family, right? And so I have those chapters. Those are sort of there. I'm sure lots of 20-somethings are going to go to those chapters first. But what I've learned is that what actually makes a rich life goes so much beyond those things. And in fact, the other things in our life are intertwined with career and family. And so the chapters that I loved writing about were the chapter on hobbies, the chapter on faith, the chapter on our body. Those were all chapters that I really loved writing. And I didn't expect to write those chapters, nor did I expect to love them so much. But let me just start with the hobbies chapter, because I think it's pretty relevant to everybody right now. But I never really thought that much about hobbies in my 20s, and I don't think that most people do. And so what are hobbies, right? These are passions that we engage with outside of work and family. They're things that we're really passionate about, and they're also things that require some level of skill. And so, so like I eat, ice cream as if it was a hobby, or like, or almost a job, but that's not considered a hobby because it doesn't require skill, right? And so basically a hobby is something that requires skill and that we do outside of work. And the thing is that, I didn't fully understand how valuable these other things are to us. And as I was working on the book, I spoke to hobbies scholars and experts, and there's all of this research about how it is so valuable to have these other areas of passion, because people who have these other things in their life tend to have better cognitive development over the course of their life. They're able to sort of push off all kinds of cognitive decline. They tend to be so much happier. They tend to be more productive at their jobs. And it makes a lot of sense, because I think especially for those of us who are millennials, we will put so much of ourselves, our identities, our passions into work and family, right? And I think that by throwing ourselves into these things, we will burn ourselves out. That's just the way it's going to go. There are going to be times when, like in the moment we're in right now, where work is going to wear us down and our family, is going to fray at times. And if we don't have these other things in our life that give us joy and pleasure and that take us away from these other things, we will not have a full, rich, and happy life. I didn't know that. I wish I had in my 20s.
I didn't know it till my 40s. And I had mentioned this to Liz when we first met, that my sister and I have always sort of mocked people with hobbies.
Totally, I did too.
What do they have time for? And one of the worst pieces of advice I remember was giving to a friend and his daughter, who's just about to be in her 20s. She really loves hockey, ice hockey. And I remember saying, it's not like you're going to be a hockey player. Like, you're not going to do it as a job. So therefore, why is it taking up so much of your time, right? And this idea, the luxury, it felt like this entitled thing that you could spend so much time doing something that wasn't going to be on your professional resume. And now I have I've done a 180. And in fact, you're right, during this pandemic, we're all realizing the number of friends I have who are tie-dyeing clothing now, that, or making sourdough bread or whatever it is, where they are finding joy they never knew they could find in something other than the thing they make money doing, or no longer make money doing. So what a gift to have that chapter.
And I feel like, and the other thing about hobbies is that, like exactly what you're saying, you don't have to be good at it necessarily. This is not about being good at something. And that is what's so liberating about these other things in your life. At work, you need to be good at what you're doing, and you need to be constantly pushing yourself, and perfectionism is not a bad thing in that sphere. With your family, you want to be a good parent, you want to be a good partner. With your hobby, that is just for you. It is just for you to enjoy and to take pleasure out of, and how good you are is not relevant, right? I wish, just like you, I wish I had known about this. In my 20s, I wasn't thinking about hobbies at all. I basically picked up whatever hobby whoever I was dating was doing, right? Or, whatever friend in my life. And so I spent a few weeks knitting because I had a friend who knit. I had a boyfriend who was really into progressive rock, so I took up drumming for a little while. I didn't really spend much time on it. But here's the thing. It is easier to pick up new skills and new hobbies in your 20s. because our brains haven't really, formed yet, right? And so we still have the ability to pick up things easier in our 20s. So it gets harder as we get older to pick up new skills, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do that, right? Just because it's harder, I think because it's harder, most people don't stick with new hobbies as they get older, because they just find it frustrating. Like learning a new instrument, at 40 is really hard, right? And like learning, knitting or gardening or whatever, it's harder to do these things later on, but we should all absolutely be investing in these things because they're so good for us. And you know what? We're in the middle of a pandemic and a lot of our routines have been disrupted. A lot of us have more time than we had in the past. And a lot of us are very stressed. And there's a lot of research that shows that picking up hobbies and pursuing these hobbies, because of everything we've talked about, because they're a source of passion, they give us pleasure, they're really, really good for helping manage stress. So my recommendation is, there have been all of these silly, conversations that sort of like make light of the fact that we're all knitting and, using sourdough starters. Go out and do that. There's a lot of research that shows that developing and cultivating these hobbies will be good for you for the rest of your life. So that's my advice to everybody.
I want to talk a little bit about the faith chapter, because when I got there too, this is not something I was thinking about in my 20s, and it is often something we think about. Many people sort of forget that piece of their history, if it is a part of their history, and sometimes they have children and come back and rediscover it. And it was fascinating to think about the array of people in my life in my 20s and who actually was thinking about faith all. So what did you find when you wrote about it, when you talked to people about it? And, I'm sure it was quite a range of where it was.
Yeah, absolutely. I was surprised to find that most people actually stick with whatever decision that they make about their faith in their late teens and early 20s. That was really surprising to me, because I think the conventional wisdom is that people come to faith later in life, and when they have children, or even later, when they're approaching the end of their life and they're beginning to think about these large existential questions. But that's not true. A lot of the data shows that people tend to be formed in terms of their persuasion about faith fairly young, and they tend to stick pretty closely to that decision as they move through life. That was a surprising insight to me. And so that's the one data point that I discovered. But the other is that for those of us who are in our 20s and 30s now, faith is just not a big part of our lives. Many of us have been really traumatized by the churches and various faith, the houses of worship that we attended when we were younger, because what was preached from pulpits did not align with our understanding of the world, and particularly issues that have to do with LGBT, acceptance, issues that have to do with things like abortion. Many of us, grew up going to churches where, a lot of the preaching was against what we understood to be true about the world. And so it created a big cognitive disconnect that has left many people who are, in their teens and in their 20s and those in early 30s, feeling very disconnected from faith. But at the same time, a lot of people of these generations do still have this craving for something spiritual. And there also is this kind of lack of community, because for so much of history, religious institutions were a primary way that we formed connection with other people, right? The people that we attended church with historically were the people who would be there when our children were born to bring us food, right? They would be the people who would be with us when difficult things happened, like we lost, somebody dear to us in our life. Those of us who have abandoned, organized religion feel this kind of gaping hole when it comes to community, and also when it comes to spirituality, because I think that rejecting some aspects of religion doesn't mean that we've lost our desire to believe in something greater than ourselves, or to connect with something deeper, right? And so here we are in this like strange period. And so in my book, I basically talk about this, and I don't have, it's not like I'm making an argument that people should become more religious. That's not what I'm trying to do. But what I am saying is that if people do feel like they're missing out on community, there are other ways. It's important to cultivate this, right? And to find ways of building community. If church happened to be a big part of the way that your community connected when you were growing up, you might need to find other sources of community. And then in terms of this idea of spirituality, I think that there are so many amazing ways that people can find that in ways that are not part of sort of the traditional organized religion of the past. There are now churches that are Christian, but that are very accepting, right? There's a pastor that I talked to in the book who has an eco church, right? And so he believes that his faith is tied to the way that we treat the planet. And so, he and his congregation like together till the soil. I mean, there are very creative ways that people are trying to find this spirituality again outside of this. And so I encourage people who feel that that's lacking in their life to seek stuff out, because there's lots of stuff out there.
I want to talk about advice because that's my business, but also because I feel like people in their 20s are often most likely group of people to get advice, sometimes unsolicited, from people. They're probably the largest group that writes to me, maybe into their early 30s, and the advice is conflicting. And even in my own column, a lot of people write in mostly about their love lives, obviously, and they will say, I'm looking for, I just had a bad breakup and I'm devastated. How will I ever meet someone? But I wanted to be married by 30 and now I'm 28 and still single. And inevitably, the comment section is a bunch of older people. They could be anywhere from 31 to 100, and they say, don't worry about it. Nothing in your 20s matters. Talk to me when talk to me when you're 35. And it's almost like, to these people, we don't count until we're their age, right? And yet when I look back at my own life, and where I am now, so much of it is about the priorities I set in my 20s. So, but this is conflicting, right? We're often told in our 20s, oh, try to do this by this age. Like, oh, maybe you want to meet somebody by 30. So many people will also say, well, thank goodness I didn't meet my spouse until after I was 30. That's when I was really my full person. So what is a 24-year-old supposed to do with all of this conflicting advice about find a soulmate, don't find a soulmate, it doesn't matter, it does matter. We seem to all think we know what's best for these people. How important is it? Because you call these years your rocket years, which might be scary to some, that especially for 20-somethings who right now can't do a whole lot of rocketing anywhere because they're literally inside. So how do you assign value to these years without it being intimidating?
Yeah. So I'm going to take that question in two parts. The first part being the advice part. But I honestly found, I think I was in search of wisdom in my 20s because, I was lost. I think, a lot of us felt lost, and I was searching for advice and insight. And I often was traumatized by what I heard. I think that the wisest people in my life, like my father, for instance, were people who told me that it was very much that there is diversity in the world, and that we are complex people, and our values and our identities are so different from one another that providing generic advice is not going to work. And so those are the people that I really whose opinion and whose advice really I valued. But there were lots of people who said all kinds of like bizarre things to me. Like people who told me, like, oh, you need to really get on this, relationship thing, and you need to sort this out with your boyfriend soon because your eggs are gonna rot. And I was like, well, that's really awful and stressful, right? I mean, what if I don't want to have kids? Like, it's just, there's a lot of terrible advice out there. And so for those of us who are older, and now that people are coming to me for advice, I want to be sure that I'm in that former category rather than the latter, right? I don't want my advice to ever be traumatizing. And I think that the way to start, like, you know, when people do it, so first of all, I would rather not give unsolicited advice. But when people do come and ask me about, you know, what they should do, now that I've written this book, there are a lot of 20-somethings who are coming to me for advice. I think the most important thing to tell people is that your 20s are this period where the most important thing that you can do is figure out what really matters to you, and you know, and who you are, you know, what you want from life. You know, we have this amazing period in our 20s where we have freedom to explore the world. And yes, there is a chapter on friendship, and I can talk to you about that in a second. But yeah, it's about having this amazing opportunity to explore so that you can figure out what really, really matters to you. And that's different for different people. So, you know, in my chapter on kids, for instance, I make it very clear that, you know, there's kind of a decision tree that you can work with in your 20s when it comes to thinking about whether you want kids at all. You know, why do you want kids, right? Like what is, you know, what makes somebody choose to have kids or not have kids? And then if you do want to have kids, you have so many options in terms of, do you want to have them, you know, do you want biological children? Do you want to adopt? There's so many options, right? And so I think that the thing that we should be doing is we should be encouraging 20-somethings and helping them in that journey of self-discovery so that they can figure out what it is that matters to them and what they value, so that then they can sort of chart their own course, right? And that's really what I'm trying to do with the book. But yes, I really, really disliked unsolicited advice in my 20s. It was awful. Actually, the beginning of my 20s, I remember really sort of like clinging on to people's advice, you know, when I was pretty young and inexperienced. And as time went on, you know, I realized that it wasn't working for me, or that it was leading me in the wrong direction. And then I became very angry about it. And so let's not be those kinds of advice givers.
It's good advice for the advice givers. I mean, I think it's also so much of the advice we give younger people is the thing we wish we knew based on what we want now. And these things are, you know, they're varied.
And so, they're us just projecting. But I can answer the second question about the rocketing part if you'd like.
Yeah, please do. Please do.
Totally. So yes, it seems very stressful, right? Because there's all of this research that shows that the decisions that we make in our 20s have kind of an outsized role in our futures, right? And that's just because, you know, so much of our life is yet unwritten in our 20s. And so any decision that we make is setting us on a course, and, you know, and after that, you're changing course. You're not starting the course from the beginning, right? And that takes more work. But, you know, what's great about our 20s is that they are a chaotic period. And I think that the main tension that all of us have in our 20s is this anxiety between, on the one hand, making smart choices, and on the other hand, feeling free to go out and make mistakes and, you know, explore the world. And I think the thing is that when I was in my 20s, I always felt pulled in both of these directions. Whenever I was doing the right thing and following the right path and dating the person that I thought was right for me, I felt this FOMO to like go out there and just like make all my mistakes, right? And do something really crazy and impulsive. And whenever I was doing something crazy and impulsive, like, you know, quitting my PhD program and breaking up with my boyfriend to backpack through India, I felt like, oh my gosh, like I'm really just escaping my life. What I've learned now is that both of those things are so crucial. We need these moments of exploring the world and being impulsive because they inform us about what is out there and who we are. And that helps us when we're confronted with a decision that we have to make. It just gives us more knowledge and more insight that allows us to make those decisions. So this idea of being in your 20s, you know, it's not as scary as I think it seems at the beginning, because it's really just about trying to figure out, as I was saying before, you know, what you want and who you are and what you want from life, right? And the other thing is that there's always time to course correct later. And I think that all of us are familiar with this, right? You know, if you're not happy with any choice that you've made, there's always time to go back and make sense of it. I think it all has to do with, as you're saying, just being thoughtful. And that's how we started this conversation. You can't make those changes. You can't make your life more what you want it to be unless you've given yourself the opportunity to think about it. And I think that that's the amazing moment we're in right now.
I'm so glad somebody asked about friendship, because I don't know about you, but I'm very interested in, every time I say I'm interested in younger people, I feel like I'm like a grandma, but I love finding out that younger people watch television that to me seems like it should be super dated to them. You know, like this obsession with Friends among like much younger people, where I'm like, I don't even know if I was that, I mean, maybe I should be the right generation for, I think I was even young for Friends, but a lot of the shows that I find that are, you know, former Boston Globe interns, for instance, are interested in, is that they're starting with Grey's Anatomy from season 1. And a lot of these shows are essentially about friendship packs and communities and networks. And so I wondered if you might talk about, especially if you're a 20-something now and even in a pandemic, but it's a bit more fractured in terms of the way we connect, right? Talk about what you say about friendship and what it means to people in their 20s.
This was fascinating to me, and there's a lot of data about this. So thank you for the question, John Paul. So this is what we know about friendship. Our circle of friends peaks at the age of 25, and it keeps shrinking and shrinking and shrinking after that. So the reason that 25 is this period where we're surrounded by more people, it makes a lot of sense, right? Because we're still connected to the people we met as children. So people from, you know, our home communities, people from high school and so on, people from our churches if we went to church growing up. But we also now have friends that we made in college, and the friends that we make in the first workplaces that we are part of. But then in the years that follow, what happens is that the circle of friends keeps shrinking and shrinking, just because life happens. You know, a lot of people end up, you know, in serious relationships that gives them less time for other relationships. Then there's also the fact that, you know, once you have kids, as everybody here who has kids knows, kids just suck up all the other time that you have. And then you wake up one day, you know, at the age of 37, like I recently did, and discover that you're surrounded by a lot less people than you were before. And this isn't necessarily all bad. I think that as we get older, we become more aware of what we need from our friends, what we want from our friends, the kind of people we want to be surrounded by. So saying goodbye to some of the people that we met when we were younger is perfectly reasonable. The problem, though, is that a lot of us are not happy with the communities that we have. We wish we had more friends. And there's actually a lot of research showing that Americans say that they're lonely, that you know, they don't have as many friends as they would like. They're not, you know, don't have close, intimate relationships with people outside of their family. And so this is a real problem, and it's something that, you know, the reason that I wrote this chapter is because I think that the drop off that happens in our late 20s and early 30s, a lot of that happens without us really thinking about it. And so I think that if you happen to be in your 20s and 30s, you should be investing in those relationships. You know, like don't let your close friends fall away. Take the time to interact with them. You know, like if you've moved across the country, create phone dates. You know, just try and hold on to those friends, because when you wake up again at the age of 40, you want to still have them in your life. The other thing that I learned is that, again, it's much easier for us to make friends when we're younger. And that's because friend making is actually a skill. There are lots of psychologists have broken down friendship into a lot of different steps. And we don't realize that we are doing all of these steps when we're in school and so on, because, you know, we're just interacting with so many people. We sort of stop realizing that we're actually, every time we form a friendship, we are actually doing a lot of different steps that allow us to deepen that relationship. And it gets harder to form new friendships as we get older, simply because we've gotten rusty at it. But that doesn't mean that again, that doesn't mean that we can't make friends when we're older. It's just that most of us are not doing it because we've like sort of forgotten the micro steps that we need to get there. So today I'm going to tell you about all of those micro steps and explain how we can form friendships in the middle of a pandemic. So I'm talking about two separate things here, right? Like the first thing that I was talking about was holding on to the friends that we already have. And the second part is forming new friends. So let's just talk about the forming new friends for a second. So what psychologists have found is that we form friendships through multiple unplanned interactions with another person. So, you know, a lot of us think that making friends is about like, you know, finding somebody that we like, going out to coffee, having multiple coffee dates, and then you have a friend. But actually what people have found is that in the early stages of friendship, the best ways that we form these relationships is through these casual interactions. It's like, you know, if you think back to like school, it's like the person that was sitting next to you in lab, you know, and so, you know, twice a week you would sit next to them, and then you know, slowly you would talk, and then you'd find these connections, and then eventually you would realize that you've shared all of, you know, all of these things, and suddenly you've become a friend, right? So that's actually how friendships tend to form. And so that's a very good thing to know, because if you're out there looking to make new friends, it's much easier to do that if you're able to see a person over and over again. And that's why, you know, churches and other, you know, religious institutions were such good ways to make friends, because you would show up on Sunday after Sunday and there was no pressure to deepen that relationship. It would just kind of happen naturally through the interactions that you had. But similar things can happen if you go to the gym, you know, if you're taking a class, you know, that's why hobbies are also a good way to form friendships, because by doing something that's not about the friendship, you can have these multiple unplanned interactions that eventually lead to deeper friendships. And that's the first stage. To deepen the friendship further, to sort of go from being a kind of an outer like acquaintance to being somebody who's like a deep friend, that has to do with vulnerability and opening up. And I think that a lot of us get, you know, I'm really bad at that. I talk about, actually in the book, if you're interested, I have in the friendship chapter, I basically take all of this advice and apply it to my life and try and make a friend from scratch. And I do make a friend from scratch, and she's still in my life today. But I go through all of these different steps. But the thing that I struggled with was this issue of opening up. So this friend of mine, Tara, she was actually really good at opening up and sharing things about her marriage and her kids and her life. And I was just not good at that. I had like lost the ability to do that. And so that's something that I had to work on, but that's what deepens friendships further later on. Okay, so that's the process of deepening, of, you know, of starting a relationship and deepening it. And then there's this issue of just like holding on to friends, right? How do we do all of these things in the midst of a pandemic when we're socially distant from one another? So now is actually not a bad time to be making new friends. I think a lot of people find that a bit crazy, but you know, if there are people, you know, that you're meeting through your job, for instance, or you know, through like a hobby that you might have started, like you might see somebody on some sort of board, you know, like a Facebook group or something like that you really like. It's not a bad idea to maybe just, you know, see if that person wants to hang out like virtually or maybe even in person, like I did with Meredith. I asked her whether she wanted to.
And you initiated, you know, yeah. It's so funny, like in this world where it's you don't even think about seeing somebody in person. It was so delightful to say, do you want to meet me outside? And like, if the weather's nice, we can sit 20 feet apart and what a joy, right?
I was trying to use the advice that I recently had learned in my book, right? And so I was like, Meredith, we're going to have a drink.
So all you have to do is write a book, get a moderator, and then ask them.
Yeah, in 3 years you're good. You know, you're going to be fine. But if you're trying to do any of this now, here's what I would recommend. Zoom and FaceTime dates are really exhausting, because what's happening is that we're basically forced for like half an hour or 45 minutes to stare at each other and interact, and it's exhausting. That's why we all have what we call Zoom fatigue, right? Nobody wants to be on another screen. So and because that doesn't mimic the way that we form relationships in the real world. And so what I think we should be doing is we should maybe be doing more casual things, like maybe having, cooking dinner together with Zoom in the background, or, doing an activity together with Zoom in the background, right? It's about putting less pressure on that early interaction because it's so unnatural. I mean, that's just not how people form relationships in the real world. So if you're trying to, deepen relationships or and so on, I would say that like these kinds of interactions on, on a computer, they're really, really bad. Psychologists would say that they're really not very good at helping to create the glue that forms these kinds of human connections. So things that you can do are just like, do a group activity, maybe watch a movie together. There's all of these websites now have group, watching, you and a friend can watch a show together. These are things that sort of mimic what people do in the real world. And also, hi, Hanan.
I think, you bring up something. I think about one of my closest friendships as an adult is somebody I met in college. We were acquaintances, we drifted apart, and one night, 10 years ago, I tweeted that I was watching The Vampire Diaries, and she wrote back, I too watched The Vampire Diaries. And then for the next 10 years of our lives, she's one of my closest friends. And it was so silly to me that it took social media to bring a real life friend back into my life. And that brings me to want to ask you about social media, because to me, the mark of true millennial, a lot of the anxiety, understandable anxiety that comes with being a millennial and Gen Z, everybody that comes after, is that I got to be in my 20s with no social media until my late 20s. I think in my late 20s, Facebook became open to non-college students, which means I spent my 20s not having any idea what anybody else was doing. And everybody younger than me was in a state of FOMO and comparison, and wait, they're on the beach, wait, their job is better. So on the one hand, it creates this culture, I'm sure, that is daunting of accomplishment and filtered. And on the other hand, it's such an incredible connector that I deeply depend on now that we're in a pandemic. So can you talk a little bit about how social media might shape the world for a 20-something right now in a way that perhaps someone older on our call might not truly understand? And is it, I'm always asked, is it good or evil? And everything is always somewhere in between, but what's your take on that?
Yeah, so I think that for those of us who are millennials, right? So who are in our 20s and early 30s, we actually had the worst of it because it was a new concept for us. I was, in the first generation to ever have Facebook, and it was this like amazing thing that was going to change the world, right? And we also took everything very seriously in terms of our self-presentation on Facebook and Instagram, and that shaped us in our 20s and 30s in terms of comparing ourselves to one another. Right? There was this period in my late 20s when everybody I knew was getting married, and not only did I know that, but I could see it happen, and there were all these like beautiful photo albums that began, people that I didn't even know or care that much about. Like I was, getting these intimate shots of their wedding day. And I was like a hot mess. I had just broken up with my boyfriend, and I was backpacking through India. And every time I got a little bit of service, I would be like, oh, there's somebody else who got married. So it's not been healthy for us. It certainly has not. And I think it has contributed to this loneliness that is a pandemic, right? Another pandemic for people in their 20s. There's all of this data that shows that those of us who are in our 20s and 30s feel very lonely because all of our social connections are mediated, or many of our social connections are mediated on these platforms that are so superficial and that don't allow us to create this depth of friendship that I was talking about before. The thing that is really encouraging to me is that it seems like Gen Z, who came after us and for whom these were not shiny new things, these were just part of reality, they are seeing through the BS, right? They're able to recognize that these are not, this is not reality. And that's why there's this kind of wave of young people who are rejecting lots of social media, or rejecting it the way that millennials experience it. That's why, these kinds of, things like Snapchat and TikTok, which are sort of ephemeral, right, tend to be more, more valuable to these young people. They're aware that these are just sort of snapshots in time, and there's a whole different conception there. So yes, it has sort of like ruined our lives in so many different ways. But once again, it's just a tool, and I think that those young people who are in their 20s and their teens recognize that. So it really has to do with how we use these things. And I think that there's a lot of research about how there are ways to use these tools to actually deepen our relationships and to interact with people. So it really has to do with our mindset and how we interact with the technology in the first place. But there's all of this research that says that people who actually try and stay in touch with each other on these platforms like Facebook, and who use that as an opportunity to connect on a deeper level, right? Like, they might meet somebody on a message board and then continue a conversation and use that to go offline, perhaps. Or there are some friends that I have that are actually, decent friends, and I actually like seeing their photos regularly pop up, and then I'll, talk to them about it, and and have these interactions. There are ways that these social platforms could actually be amazing, as ways to deepen relationships. It just has to do with how we treat these tools. And so I think the thing that I would say is that it's really about us. The onus is on us to think about how we're using these platforms. And if we feel like we're not really getting much out of them, and they're in fact making us more depressed and lonely, we can either choose to get rid of them altogether, which is what some people are doing, or we can think, carefully about how we can use these devices and these platforms to our advantage, and to actually make things better for us.
I want to ask a question from Annalise that is a question that's close to my heart. Do you think our society places too much emphasis on love and finding the one? I feel like that can sometimes be really unhealthy. And
yeah, I think I loved writing that chapter on love, because I think it showed me how much artifice is in this whole concept of love, right? Because actually, while for millennia there has been this ideal of romantic love, I think it was really instructive to me that that actually for most of history, even to our parents' generation, love was not actually something real that most people had, right? It was this ideal, and it wasn't actually something that a lot of people had in their marriages, right? Their marriages were very utilitarian. That was one really fascinating piece of insight, which then instructed me in terms of like how we're dealing with love and marriage, right? So first of all, to answer your question, I would say that perhaps we have, had the wrong, not only have we valued this idea of love too much, but it's actually, in many cases, not even a real thing. It's an ideal. It's not something that's actually real. Companionate marriage, this idea of having somebody that you marry that is a best friend, but that you're also sexually attracted to, that has not actually been something that most people have had throughout humanity, right? So it's kind of a fiction. But for millennials and now Gen Z, there's this new thing that's happening, which is that people who are socioeconomically similar are able to find each other wherever they might be. They might not be necessarily like in your direct community, but because of online dating, we're able to find people who, have similar levels of education and so on. And basically what's happening with millennials is that people who are socioeconomically similar are pairing up. And so perhaps what we have thought of as this idea of a soulmate was actually just being with somebody who was like you on multiple dimensions. I mean, I think that that's really what it comes down to, because all of the data shows that now that we have access to all of these like online dating tools, and now that women can be educated as much as men, and can be and are in the workplace as much as men, when people are looking for partners, and when people say that they are satisfied in their marriages, what they're saying is actually that they found somebody who's pretty similar to themselves socioeconomically. That was fascinating to me, because actually what it says is, what that means is that a lot of this language that we've used throughout time to talk about relationships were really about about things that were very different than what we thought of, than what the books, than what Jane Austen is like writing about, right? It's about these very sort of pragmatic unions. So what I would say is, like, so it's kind of indirectly answering your question. I think that for most of humanity, this idea of love, was actually not really grounded in reality. And that when we actually think about what we want as people, what we're looking for, I think, is somebody that we can spend, decades with, and but when we talk to them, they really sort of get us. And I think that what's really wonderful is that it seems like millennials and now Gen Z have even more opportunity to find somebody who is like that, because society has changed, right? Women have been, elevated. We now have all these opportunities that we didn't have before. And as a result, it is easier for men to find women and for women to find men, or for men to find men and women to find women, or people to find partners that actually share, aspects of who they are, and will actually lay the foundation for a long-term relationship that is based on, mutual interests and, and similar personalities. And I think that that's really wonderful. But I think all of these like notions of like, yeah, I think when it comes down to it, it's always been very pragmatic, and this ideal of love has actually, when broken down, not been a very substantial idea. I would love to hear Meredith's opinion on this.
Well, if I'm laughing to myself as you say this, because I've spent much of the pandemic reading Regency romance novels, which I highly recommend, because they're just like people, and sometimes there's a horrible illness, but they go about their day, and they, it's like, but in many of these romantic situations that they come up with, they get married, and the romance novel then begins. They realize, oh my goodness, I'm in love with my spouse. That is the surprise, that they have married into a family for incredibly mundane and financial reasons. And the extra special romance novel part of it is that they fall madly in love with the person they happen to marry. So I think, when they called it's a love match. Who knew you could ever find a love match? So I think it is very interesting that, this sort of myth of it's always been about soulmates, and how pop culture contributes to this is intense. And I think as we get older, we start to realize, when you were saying the socioeconomic part, that makes a lot of sense to me. It's like, this person shares my values, and also they're pretty cute. That's not a bad package, is what I would say, based on the letters I received.
And the only other thing that I would add to that, to answer Annalise's question, is that I mean, children have always historically been a big part of this union forming, right? And I think that what's really great is that, and I have a whole chapter on family, and what I think is really great is that we don't have to have kids if we don't want to anymore, right? And that just opens up all these other possibilities when it comes to relationships. Or we could have kids much later than people did in the past. Because again, marriage has always been a very pragmatic thing, right? It's about forming this union so that you can have kids, and then there's this patriarchal structure and all of that. But it's all exploded, right? And so if you decide that you're not the kind of person who wants kids, or you've decided that, maybe you're okay with putting off kids until later, or, or having kids through adoption, or something else, there are so many options that weren't available to us before. So just, I think we should embrace that and enjoy it, right?
I think it's great. I know we have to wrap up, but I want to thank you for all of this. And I just want to remind everyone that the book is clearly for sale. I highly recommend getting it for 20-somethings, I also highly recommend getting it for 43-year-olds, because I happen to have gotten so much out of this book.
And if you buy it from Belmont Books. There's a link in your Zoom.
Belmont Books. We are so deeply lucky to live in a community with so many independent bookstores. And one of the things I miss most is going to Belmont Books, buying everything, overeating, because they also have food there, and getting all of my favorites. So it is so wonderful that they've continued with online events and selling books and having curbside pickup. So thank you so much to everybody for supporting, and congratulations, Liz. This was a great guide to life for all of us.
Thank you so much.
It really was. Thank you both so much, Liz and Meredith. What a great pairing. What a great conversation. People in the audience, thank you so much for coming. And even though there is Zoom exhaustion, spending your evening with us and asking some really great questions. It was really a wonderful time, and we appreciate all of you.
Thank you so much. This was such a pleasure. I really appreciate you all being here. And thank you to everybody who dropped by. It really made my week.
Thank you. Good night, everyone, and be safe.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.